The scene was picture perfect, a warm family moment, a serene tableau that might have been plucked straight from a Norman Rockwell painting. Yet, this scene would never adorn the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. My mother-in-law and my mother stood on either side of the hospital bed, their eyes filled with love as they gazed at the bed's occupants, my wife and her newborn baby, who was nursing. Newborns may not be universally cute, but it was impossible to deny that this little girl was faring well. Her once mottled red face had transformed into a soft, light pink hue. The waxy vernix that resembled lard had been gently washed away, and even her slightly misshapen skull was rounding out nicely. As I watched, I couldn't help but notice the striking resemblance between my daughter and my wife, Susan. It was a surreal moment, one that made me reflect on the past 6 years of our marriage and the love we shared. My wife, now a mother, sat in the bed with her torso covered, her beautiful eyes filled with pride and love. Our daughter, a newborn, latched onto my wife's breast, seeking nourishment. I couldn't help but admire the way my wife's large and firm breasts, which she had always been proud of, now provided sustenance for our child. Her overall appearance was still that of the cute, bubbly girl next door that everyone knew and loved. As I observed this intimate moment, I experienced a mix of emotions. Part of me felt a deep sense of joy and connection, witnessing the bond between my wife and our child. Another part of me, however, was troubled by the change in our family dynamic and the new responsibilities that came with parenthood. I quietly observed Susan feeding the baby as both our mothers offered unsolicited advice. I knew Susan was capable, having attended numerous parenting classes together, including breast feeding instruction. A knock at the door startled me. The labor and delivery nurse and a woman from admin entered the room. The nurse introduced the visitor, Miss Dankins, who handed Susan a certificate of live birth application to complete. In any other setting, the scene would have been bizarre. A woman nursing a baby while others discussed paperwork. But here it was just another day. Take your time, Susan, Miss Dankins advised. Complete nursing your baby first. When you have a moment, please fill in the details in the highlighted spaces, although your hospital records already include most of the necessary information, such as the birthplace and date. We'll need your and your husband's full names, your maiden name, your ages, and more. We'll enter the rest and submit the paperwork to the parish courthouse for you. In about 2 weeks, you'll receive a copy of the birth certificate by mail. With that, Miss Dankins departed. Honey, why don't you handle this and fill in the information? Susan suggested, smiling as she spoke. No, I think I'll let you fill it out later when your hands aren't full, I answered. Besides, I think we should wait until the DNA test come back to know if I am the father or not. The room fell silent as if time itself had paused. For those who were unfamiliar with the concept, a record was a vinyl disc with grooves that held sound. A needle would trace the grooves, creating the music. But that was irrelevant now. All eyes were on the couple, waiting for their next move. The room was filled with an unexpected silence. 4 women, their eyes wide with disbelief, stared at me. The baby, oblivious to the tension, continued to cry as she was removed from my grasp. My mother-in-law was the first to speak, her voice filled with disbelief. You must be joking. Why would you ever consider such an idea? She turned to Susan, who was now glaring at me with a mix of shock and anger. How dare you accuse me of something so terrible? What kind of person do you think I am? She tried to smile, but it didn't quite come off as genuine. Oh, I understand. It's April Fool's Day. You're just playing a prank on us. That's not funny at all. You should know better. Her body language contradicted her words, and her shock was clear. I remained silent, my expression cold. I'm not joking, I said firmly. There's a strong possibility I'm not the father. How could you think I'd ever cheat on you? She demanded, her eyes wide with disbelief. Have I ever given you any reason to suspect me? Name one time I did. Just one time I gave you any reason to think I was seeing someone else. Instead of answering her question, I said, so you went with your default response. Deny, deny, deny. And you are even doing it with a straight face. I'm impressed. I turned to my mother-in-law. Perhaps I should move the car seat from my car to yours, so you can take her and the baby home this afternoon. I hope you can stay with Susan for a while. I know both you and Mom offered several times, but we told you we could handle it." I turned to leave the room, stopping only when I heard a stern command from behind. "Stop right there, Jason Louis Fontano." My mother's voice reached out and froze me in place. You do not just walk away after a statement like that. I stood still, contemplating my response. My mom and mother-in-law exchanged concerned glances as Susan sobbed. "You can't leave me in little Connie. She's our baby and you're her dad." Before addressing my mom, I addressed my wife. "I understand the role, but there's a difference between being a dad and being a father." My mom grabbed my shirt, bringing us close together. Her gaze was intense, just like when I was young. "Jason, what's going on? Why are you suddenly acting so foolish? You can't be having second thoughts about being a dad. Remember how excited you were when Sue told us she was pregnant." "Oh no, you're not getting out of this that easily," Mom exclaimed. "You've put so much effort into preparing for the baby's arrival. You've read countless books, set up the nursery, and bought all sorts of toys." She paused for a moment, then continued, "But now you're telling me you've had a change of heart. What happened? What's this little revelation of yours?" Tony excitedly said, "We all noticed you haven't held Connie yet. We thought you were just adjusting to being a parent. What's going on?" With determination, I replied, "I'll be the best dad if she's mine, but last week, I found out I might not be her father. I won't connect with a baby I won't help raise." Surprised, my mother and Tony responded, "What?" "I'll support the baby if it's mine, but Clive Adams needs to take responsibility for his own child," I declared loudly. Susan gasped. "Clive and I never did anything. We never had sex. How can you say that?" Our mom and Tony exchanged glances as I stood by Susan's bed. "Really? You're still denying that you and Clive didn't have an affair for almost 6 months? You ended it only after discovering you were pregnant and told him, right?" Susan shouted back, "No, we didn't, and anyone who says otherwise is a liar." "Who is Clive Adams?" Tony asked, her voice filled with curiosity. "And how do you know about my daughter's affair?" She demanded to know the source of the information. "I can't reveal that," I replied, keeping the details under wraps, "but I can tell you that Clive Adams himself admitted to it." Susan's eyes widened in shock. "Clive would never do that," he promised. Tony's gaze shifted between her daughter and me. She wanted the truth. "What do you know about this situation?" I hesitated before responding to my wife. "Clive confessed everything under pressure. He was in immense pain, and that's when he revealed the truth about your daughter." "Rubbish! Clive was fine yesterday when he called to check on me and the baby," Susan exclaimed, her voice filling the room. She was on edge, having just given birth, and may not have realized what she said. But her words couldn't be ignored. Tony's face fell, and I glanced at my own mother, who stood with her mouth open in surprise. "So you're still in touch with your old boyfriend," I remarked. "Did he give you any more guidance or support about keeping me in the dark? About his potential role as the father?" Susan broke down, sobbing loudly. Her wails were so intense that 2 nurses rushed into the room. "We were so cautious," she cried. "You couldn't have known, nobody knew. She's a bit surprised," I mentioned to the first nurse. She gave me a defensive look, protecting her patient. I must have sounded strange to her. We were talking about potential fathers for her to list on the birth certificate application. The nurse looked at me still. "Apparently, I'm supposed to write my name in the space. I want to wait and see if I'm the father or it's the man she had an affair with when she became pregnant." The light from the hallway illuminated the nurse's face as she sensed Susan's distress. She gently guided Susan to take deep breaths, reminiscent of her labor. "Ms. Fontenot, let's stay calm. We'll find a natural solution first," she advised. Meanwhile, the 2 mothers approached, whispering urgently. "Explain what's happening," Mom demanded in a low tone. Today, Mom's language had grown more intense, using strong words twice. "Sue seems upset about something," my mother-in-law mentioned gently. "We just want to understand what's going on." I sighed, knowing I had to explain. Something unexpected happened, but I'll keep it PG-13. Sue found out she's pregnant, and we're all shocked. We thought we were being careful, but it seems life had other plans." Susan nodded, her eyes filled with emotion. "Yes, we were cautious, but sometimes things don't go as planned." My mother-in-law and Tony exchanged glances, still curious, but respecting Sue's privacy. "Indeed, you were very subtle about it." "I didn't even suspect a thing," I confessed. Clive is truly a master of persuasion. To secure his next deal, or in this instance, his latest conquest, he had to demonstrate his prowess. She acknowledged with a nod. We both knew she recognized the connection, as Cheryl Watkins was a familiar face to her from their shared workplace over the last few years. Cheryl and her husband, Steve, were acquaintances, and we frequently encountered each other in social settings. Clive persuaded Cheryl to join him at a rented hotel room, but her concern was whether he would reveal their secret to her husband. To prove his discretion, Clive shared stories of his past relationships. Cheryl couldn't think of anyone he might have been involved with outside of his public girlfriends, so she agreed to trust him. To prove he could keep a secret, he mentioned a few office acquaintances she recognized. There was one before her, Sandy, perhaps. She ended it when her husband grew suspicious. Then there was her, for 6 months, but it ended when she discovered her pregnancy. He hoped her husband was the father, but the affair couldn't continue. He emphasized the importance of her husband, meaning me, never discovering it, fearing he might leave Sue and leave me with child support. At the time, she loudly announced her pregnancy to everyone at work when she found out. Susan was thrilled about her pregnancy, but she didn't seem to worry about the baby's parentage. She thought I wouldn't suspect her, and even if I did, I'd be too invested in the child to hold it against her. However, she was mistaken about my stance on the matter. Lana Richardson was about to become his next romantic interest. Her husband grew increasingly suspicious of her sudden late nights at work, so she had to be careful. Lana occasionally missed picking up their youngest child from daycare when it was her turn. With a decline in marital intimacy, Clive shifted his attention to Cheryl, and they became involved again. As a skilled salesman, he knew how to say the right things to win her over. Clive proved to be quite adept in the bedroom, ensuring his married lovers remained satisfied and willing to return to him for months. Tony and Mom turned to me, and Susan asking, "Why did Cheryl reveal this information now?" "It was completely unintentional," I explained. "Cheryl tends to be vocal during intimate moments." I recalled Cheryl calling out Clive's name during a passionate encounter with her husband, Steve. He confronted her, and she admitted to the situation. I smiled as I thought back to Steve's story, shared over a few beers. Steve couldn't believe the similarity between Clive and his reputation as a ladies' man. He put the pieces together and confronted Cheryl with Larry, a cop present. He warned Cheryl to speak up or face his wrath. Fearing for her safety, Cheryl chose to talk. Steve is an upstanding man who values honesty. He confides in Jason. "Jason, I felt it was important to tell you that there's a chance you might not be the father of the baby your wife is carrying. I'd expect you to let me know if you found out my wife wasn't faithful." Jason reassures him he would indeed tell him. As they sit together, they discuss Clive's situation. Jason admits to be honest. If Clive is the father, I'll let him have the child and the woman involved. He'll be overwhelmed trying to pay support. Steve adds, "I'll inform Clive that if he doesn't take care of the child, he might lose his ability to be unfaithful." Steve mentioned that Clive might lose his equipment soon. He planned to tell Sandy's husband, whom he didn't know well. Steve remembered him from high school as having a quick temper and potentially revealing their secret too soon. They decided to wait a week for Susan to give birth without added stress. Larry was also angry but agreed to keep quiet for a little longer. With the baby here, it was time to expose Clive's affairs. I shared a simplified version of the story with Tony and Mom, who were grateful for not causing more trouble during Susan's pregnancy. Tony and Mom guided me into the hallway for a private conversation, sparing Susan further distress. The second nurse took Connie to the nursery temporarily. Mom inquired, "How are you so composed?" I could sense her concern. "I've had a week to process the situation," I replied. This reassured her slightly. "I trust you'll let us know when you're ready," she said, understanding me well. Tony inquired, "When will you collect the samples for the DNA test?" She was taken aback to learn they were already submitted. Unbeknownst to her, I had discussed the matter with the head nurse following the birth. As Susan and I were married, I didn't require her approval to test the baby. I had arranged for an expedited test, and the results would be ready in 2 to 3 days. Tony looked at me, her eyes full of hope. "Can you forgive Sue and move on, even if you're not the baby's father?" She hesitated before addressing the baby by name. I realized Tony was no longer calling Sue by her name. She knew me well, but her hopes were clear. My mother gave me a knowing glance, understanding my intentions, but not pleased. "To be honest, I'm not sure I can just forget about this. Even though I am her father, I confess. I've had a week to think it over. This wasn't a simple mistake like a one-night stand after a night of drinking. It was a 6-month affair. I can't trust her anymore. She not only disrespected me in our relationship, she knew the risk of getting pregnant by that man while we were trying to have a baby. She told our family that we were trying to conceive. Her continuing to see him shows me she didn't care who got her pregnant. Have you thought about relationship advice?" Mom suggested. I assumed she mentioned this to prevent disagreements from Susan's relatives. "Also, consider the baby. It isn't her fault. That young girl could use a dad. Even if you aren't her biological father, you could still be her paternal figure. Just like I said, Mom, I don't think counseling will do a bit of good. The only thing I want to know is where I failed as a husband. There had to be something I did or didn't do for Susan to cheat. And it's not like she was really looking to replace me. Clive has a reputation as a ladies' man. He'd never want to marry her, and I'm sure she knew that. I was trying to avoid the words that came to mind, like womanizer, jerk, rude. Neither of these women deserved to have me go off on them, but I was on edge and about to lose control. Other than a good time in bed or a little extra excitement on the side, I can't really see it. I thought we had a good thing. You can imagine how I felt since I found out. Like you said, Mom, I'd been excited thinking I was going to be an uncle. Then last week, I got surprised. My whole world shifted. To be honest, right now I hope I am not the uncle. Both women look surprised at that statement. Then I don't have to be a part-time support. To be honest, I'm not sure I can stand to deal with Susan even if the baby is Mom. That alone will take some serious understanding. The nurse stepped out of the room. "Mr. Fontenot, your wife requests to see you. She mentioned that she knew you were still around, or her mother wouldn't have returned yet." The nurse appeared understanding of my emotions, or at least gave that impression. She added, "If you enter the room, please remain as calm as possible. We understand you're upset, but try not to upset her too much. We'd prefer not to sedate her. She's scheduled for discharge this afternoon. Plus, extra medications could accidentally pass to the baby through breastfeeding. You know from childbirth classes how crucial colostrum and early mother's milk are for the baby's immune system." I agreed. She was addressing my concern for the child's health, whether it was mine or not. Mom gently suggested, "Go talk to her. Tony and I will head to the coffee shop. Hand me your car keys. We'll move the car seat. I'll wait here for you to finish your conversation. Oh, and when you leave, pop by the nursery to see Connie. I think she looks a lot like you. Did when you were a newborn. Just a thought, Mom. Or are you seeing what you wanted to see?" I questioned. She shook her head. It was clear she wasn't pleased with the situation. I knew if I were the father, she'd be there to help raise the baby, regardless of my involvement with Susan. She was just as eager to be a grandmother as I was to be a father. It seemed she couldn't accept the possibility the child wasn't her grandchild. I entered the room, and Susan immediately started crying again. "You must despise me," she wailed. "I don't hate you, but I'm angry about what you did," I whispered. I wanted to scold her, but the possibility of the baby being mine kept me there. "Do you need time to plan your story, or can we talk now?" I asked, my voice tense. Susan opened her mouth to speak, but I interrupted her. "You've had 9 months to think about how to explain your affair with Clive Adams." "Clive Adams of all people," I fumed, taking deep breaths to calm down. Susan stared in disbelief. I can't believe you're saying this. You were offshore the entire time. I know you were. She paused, trying to gather her thoughts. How could you even suggest something like that? He leaned back in his chair, a smirk on his face. Well, I'm just saying it's a possibility. After all, we both know how passionate we can be, and who knows what could have happened in the heat of the moment. Susan's face flushed with anger. Don't you dare imply that I cheated on you. That's absurd, and you know it. He raised an eyebrow. I'm just saying we can't be certain, and you know how these things can happen. Susan stood up, her hands on her hips. This conversation is over. I know the truth, and so should you. With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving him sitting there, a look of confusion on his face. I left for that trip weeks ago, I said, my voice tense. Did you bring him to our house while I was gone? Did you let him move in? Did you share our bed with him? Susan's eyes widened in shock. No, we only had him over for work, barbecues, never in private. We were cautious not to raise any suspicions, but you weren't cautious enough to avoid pregnancy. I think he didn't use condoms. You can't say one broke either, I mentioned. Clive always takes risks or pushes boundaries as long as he comes out on top, I added. I did get tested for STD last week, I shared. You should get screened too, I suggested. Susan barely whispered that it was part of her early pregnancy examinations. I didn't know that was routine, I expressed, a bit surprised. I told my doctor I wanted to make sure you hadn't caught anything while you were away on business. Susan admitted sheepishly. I spent 2 to 3 weeks at a time on oil rigs, and then had 2 weeks at home. Sometimes my time at home got cut short if I had to fix problems. I was paid well for my time away, so it wasn't a problem. Until now. I looked at her, my face burning. So your doctor thinks I might have been the one cheating? Why didn't you tell the truth? I knew it wasn't a big deal, but it still irritated me that Susan was ready to blame me for her own cheating. I have a few questions I'd really like answered. The first is, why? What made you want to make a difficult decision? The second is why this choice? And why would you take a risk that could have consequences? Why didn't you consider a different approach and wait for the right time? I was trying really hard to not get concerned. I don't know, I was feeling lonely. You were occupied with other matters. I was drawn to the idea of connection, and Clive was there. We started discussing, and next thing, I knew we were making a choice. I knew he wasn't interested in a long-lasting bond. As the next question, I'd already started seeing Clive before we decided to try for a baby. He wasn't a fan of condoms. To minimize the risk, I would do she after our encounters. I knew it wasn't the best preventative method, but it seemed like the best option at the time. Susan looked taken aback and said, well, keeping your legs together in the first place would have been a better way. She seemed hurt by my previous comments. I continued, yes, it seems so now. So you knew about the affair for 4 months before I got pregnant and 2 months after. I wanted to move the conversation forward. Susan smiled. I thought I might be pregnant, but I didn't want to stop spending time with him until I knew for sure. I told myself that if I was already pregnant, it wouldn't matter if we continued seeing each other. I heard you mention to our moms that Clive ended things with me. That's true. He didn't want to keep risking that you'd find out and be forced to support the child if it was his. I raised an eyebrow. So you two discussed the situation together? Susan nodded. Of course. We both believed you'd never suspect that Connie wasn't yours, and there was a good chance she was. When you came home that first week in July, Clive and I were very careful not to see each other. While you were away, working hard to provide for our family and maintain our comfortable lifestyle, I found solace in a close friendship with Clive. Our connection went beyond friendship, and we shared intimate moments. I didn't start this relationship as a form of retaliation, but it happened. When I think about it, Clive's presence and attention might have been more fulfilling than what we had, but I can't say for certain if it was because of his actions or the circumstances we found ourselves in. She hesitated, then added, I know you're hurt, and I'm sorry for the pain this has caused. I hope we can find a way to move forward and rebuild our relationship. She shook her head, denying something unclear. It was just a moment of weakness. Clive and I only saw each other when you were away. We were cautious and rarely spent the night together. We made sure to maintain the appearance of being just co-workers. We never left early or did anything to suggest more than a friendly relationship. I always made it seem like I was mostly at home. I would park in his garage so no one would see me. She added, his size and skill in bed were no different from yours. It was just the excitement of having someone there when you weren't. That's the best way to describe it. No, I didn't do it to hurt you. It was something I did for myself. I was feeling lonely, and as you know, I enjoy intimacy. Clive started to flirt with me, and I let him. I told myself there was no harm if you didn't find out. I was completely devoted to you when you were around. That really bothered me. No matter how many times she said it, or how she explained it, I couldn't accept it. If you were only mine when you were home, you weren't truly mine, I said, trying to maintain a steady gaze. You were married to me, but involved with someone else. I couldn't help but say it. You were always cautious to avoid getting caught, but then you became pregnant. Perhaps you didn't consider a few things, like what I might do if I ever discovered that our eldest child wasn't biologically mine. Maybe through some chance, such as a difference in blood type. Or if the child didn't resemble our other kids. And that's even if you didn't cheat on me again and allowed a new man to father our next child, or if you went back to Clive for another child. I added, with a touch of bitterness. Susan shook her head vigorously. No, I promised never to be unfaithful again, and I knew once you bonded, you would never leave Connie. Even if you weren't the biological father. Just look at how you've been acting. Like our mom said, you are already completely invested in that baby. Clive agreed. Susan hesitated before answering. Honestly, I just wanted to make sure the baby had a father figure in their life. It didn't really matter to me who it was, as long as they were capable and caring. Of course, I wanted you to be the father, but after discovering I was pregnant, I just wanted the baby. I knew it would be adorable, and you would never suspect. You and Clive don't look too different. Same hair color and build. You'd be her dad and it wouldn't matter. I hope to have you around more, both for her and me. You know, I've been cutting back on my time offshore. I gave up some of that bonus money and started spending more time in the office, coordinating activities from there. I took a pay cut happily. I thought you were happy with me being home more. If my absence was such a problem, you should have addressed it earlier. All you had to do was communicate. I was doing it all for you. However, if I'm not the father, things will definitely change. I'm going to focus on my work and find someone who values our relationship completely. Not someone who breaks their vows and isn't faithful when I'm away, I said firmly. Susan started crying again. But we need you to help me with the baby. We're a family. What about our future? We've been doing well. For the past 7 months, I've been the best wife. I never even looked at another man. We could try counseling. Right now, I'm not sure there is in us. If I find out I'm the father, we'll need to figure things out. For now, I won't be around. I've already packed my important belongings. She was shocked. Where are you going? I rented an apartment last week. I wanted to wait until after the baby was born before moving out. Tony will stay with you, and my mom might help too. She's hoping it's her grandbaby. I left, and Susan cried, but not uncontrollably. Tony and my mom, who had been listening at the door, approached me. Yeah, so I listened. Sumi, Tony said, don't go too far. Maybe you two can still reconnect, especially if Connie is yours, she added hopefully. Seriously, you said you listened. Did you not catch on to a couple very pertinent facts, like she never once said she was sorry she cheated? She has no regrets. She simply said she was lonely and how unfair that was for her. She did not even seem to be concerned. I may not be the father. She just expects me to pick up the pieces and accept things. That is pure evil. Tony looked shocked at my vehemence. Her eyes filled with tears. Mom tried to calm things down. We repositioned the car seat and secured it in place. Mom said, I'll pack a bag and offer support for a while, even if you're not the father. Sue has been my daughter for the past 6 years, and I won't abandon her. I may not agree with her actions and they frustrate me, but if she hadn't just had a baby, I'd be even more upset. Tony and I would be furious with her for being so careless. I informed them about my new apartment location when they inquired. I didn't mention that I had consulted a lawyer and secured my share of our assets after settling our credit card debts. I merely secured our investment accounts, ensuring neither of us could access them without the other's consent or a court order. I instructed the lawyer to draft documents citing adultery, even though it wouldn't be a concern in our state. Susan found herself stuck at home for a few days, but she decided to make the most of her time by managing her finances online. Safety was her top priority. She had been almost certain that her marriage was beyond repair, but a small part of her couldn't let go of the doubt. After all, they had been happily married until a week ago. That small part of her heart had just been shattered. She knew she could never trust her spouse again. On her way to her new apartment, Susan called Steve, hoping for some company. She had planned to take a few weeks off work when the baby arrived, intending to help her wife get settled. The male version of maternity leave. At that moment, she really didn't want to be alone. Steve managed to sneak out during the day and met me at the bar. He worked for his father-in-law's company, uncertain about his job future after Cheryl's confession. "Did you talk to Susan?" he asked. I responded with a nod and recounted the conversation. "I visited the same lawyer as you," Steve shared. Fortunately, Cheryl's dad insisted on a prenuptial agreement when we got married. He wanted to safeguard his business and had Cheryl on the board of directors to meet some legal requirement. "She'll keep the stock, but I'll get most of the other assets." We had discussed the matter, and Susan was set to receive half of our shared assets, a considerable sum. Both of us had worked throughout our marriage, and she had a substantial income. I hoped to create enough of a stir to avoid paying alimony. I thought Tony might assist with that. Child support was only a concern if the baby was mine. I still had my reservations. "I'm going to get stuck," I grumbled. "The courts will still find a way to make me pay, even though I didn't do anything wrong." Steve shared. "Larry and I visited Don Ducat, Sandy's husband. We told him about Sandy and Clive's situation." Steve continued. "Don was furious and couldn't believe we wouldn't confront Clive, Larry being a cop. Advised Don not to act impulsively." Steve added, "Don called us cowards for not taking action against Clive. Larry then surprised me by saying we shouldn't do anything rash or illegal. Clive isn't worth risking our freedom over." "Don might be quick-tempered, but he's not stupid," Steve remarked. "He joked about making sure he wasn't caught when someone took Clive's balls off, and it seemed to calm him down enough to sit. Still, we need to do something to help Clive, but we have to be careful." "I agree that Clive needs to be dealt with, but we must do it right," I said. "Destroying his testes isn't the solution. You know Clive has been trying to keep tabs on us, like when he called Susan under the guise of checking on her and the baby." Steve stared at me, clearly confused. "You can't let him get away with that. Even if he's neutered, he can still pay child support. He needs to face the consequences of his actions. Not just mine, but yours, and maybe Don's too. Larry might stay with Lana for now since they have kids. His decision depends on how Lana reacts when he confronts her tonight." I added. "Clive will soon find out his time is running out. Once these women warn him, he might not stick around for long, but he'll be hard to find. People don't understand how difficult it is to stay hidden. It's tough to earn a good living that way, especially for someone like Clive. Do not doubt his fate. However, if we discover 4 women he wronged, there must be more. It's like searching for a needle in a haystack. If you sift through a handful of hay and find 4 needles, the entire pile must be filled with them. We need to identify other husbands who might not be pleased with his actions," I suggested. "As for his punishment, regardless of the outcome, I prefer he maintains at least one unharmed and intact." Steve appeared confused, so I clarified. "If he loses both options, he can still have desires but won't be able to act on them. It's like keeping the desire but removing the ability to fulfill it. It's a cruel twist of fate, but it would cause him mental and physical anguish." Steve started to chuckle, and I knew he would share this idea with Larry and Don later. They had already discussed it among themselves. Before leaving the bar, Steve made a call to Larry and Don to share the concept. 2 days later, I visited the house my ex-wife Susan and I used to share. Tony opened the door, "You didn't take long, huh?" she said with a hint of bitterness. "Susan was served this morning. She's been crying nonstop. The only time she seems to regain composure are when she feeds and rocks Connie. I understand your feelings, but I thought you'd wait. She's really upset. After this, she might never trust another man." "Do you think there's any hope for you two if you try counseling?" Tony asked, hopeful. I shook my head, disappointment heavy in my eyes. "It seems like there's no way for us to be together after all." I handed Tony an envelope. "This paternity test confirms it. The baby isn't mine. Clive Adams must be the father." Tony's eyes filled with tears as she realized her dreams were shattered. She needed to tell her daughter the truth. My own mother, devastated by the news, decided to stay home until we had the DNA results. She couldn't bear the thought of being near Tony and Susan after their betrayal. She too was a victim of their deceit. In a small town, rumors began to circulate about Clive Adams' encounters with married women. This sparked a conversation among a group of friends, including Steve, Larry, Dawn, and the narrator. They decided to confront their wives about the situation, making it clear that Clive was the man involved. Instead of hiding, they chose to expose him publicly. Although they didn't like being called names, they stood strong and informed everyone about their wives' encounters with Clive. It was revealed that Clive only needed to use his persuasive sales pitch with Cheryl, while the other women simply fell for his charm and eloquence. They seemed to overlook their marital commitments and enjoyed what Clive had to offer. After his actions gained notoriety, fathers of newborns connected to women he knew requested paternity tests. Later, I learned of 2 more children fathered by him. Suspicious husbands questioned their wives about their whereabouts. Multiple couples sought counseling. The truth about his actions emerged when Clive Adams disclosed it to the police himself. Clive lived a luxurious life with a grand house and numerous real estate investments. His possessions included valuable art and a versatile boat perfect for water skiing and fishing. However, his lack of liquid assets made it difficult for him to quickly relocate when necessary. In a small town, rumors began to spread about a man's infidelity. As the news reached the wronged husbands, tensions rose. Despite trying to keep a low profile, Clive was eventually discovered by a jogger, disoriented and in shock. The husbands, enraged by his betrayal, had found him and left him for dead on the sidewalk. The jogger quickly dialed emergency services. She couldn't find anything to cut the zip ties binding Clive's hands. As she tried to turn him over, Clive screamed in pain. The jogger would have been horrified had she seen the gruesome sight that was revealed. The EMT discovered that Clive's left testicle and most of his private part had been severely damaged. A wire tightly wrapped around his private part at the base was the only thing preventing him from bleeding to death. An investigation later revealed a broken and crushed brick in his kitchen, with marks from a 3-pound sledgehammer. At a local bar, Larry the cop shared a mysterious piece of advice he'd received from 2 detectives. He suggested that if someone had a 3-pound hammer with unexplained tissue on it, they should dispose of it in the swamp. Larry didn't mention his involvement in any specific incident, but he passed on the story with a grin and a wink. Meanwhile, Clive was trying to figure out who had attacked him. He couldn't recall the exact time he answered his doorbell, whether it was late at night or early in the morning. It was dark, and he had been asleep. Clive slowly opened his eyes, trying to piece together the events that led to his current state. "I think they used a stun gun on me," he murmured. "My groin still aches from the shock." He vaguely remembered 2 men, but their faces were a blur. "They warned me not to go after married women again," he added, his voice filled with pain and frustration. Determined to bring the perpetrators to justice, Clive provided the investigators with a list of women he had been involved with in recent years. Some were single, but others were married or in relationships. The list was extensive, leaving the investigators with a lot of ground to cover. The investigators faced a confusing case with numerous suspects, but no concrete evidence to pinpoint a culprit. The timing of the attack made it difficult for anyone to provide a solid alibi. Larry mentioned that Clive Adams seemed to be the prime suspect among the detectives. Months later, the investigation hit a dead end. Susan received half of their shared assets, and the house was sold. A new family moved in, with a little girl enjoying the nursery, which featured my carefully painted animals on the walls. Susan returned to her mother's house, struggling with baby care. Living with Tony alleviated her loneliness. The details of her sex life were none of my concern. She called to apologize, possibly due to Tony's intervention. She didn't clarify her reason for the apology. I had moved past it. When she requested a meeting, I declined. She inquired about Clive, accusing me of his misfortune. I responded that he deserved it and ended the call. Since then, we had no further communication, and the lawyers handled everything. She contemplated the cost of suing Clive for child support. He wouldn't pay willingly, so eventually she'd win, but lawyer fees would deplete her savings. Clive faced similar cases, with liens on his properties to prevent their sale. His medical bills, legal fees, and child support left little for living. Keeping his job was crucial. Months passed. At 3 a.m., I stood by the Econ 6, 126 rigs lower rail in the Gulf of Mexico. A chilly breeze blew, but my windbreaker kept me warm. My final journey to the rigs approached. A new chapter beckoned as I met a woman with whom I shared a strong connection. Though unsure of our future, I embraced the possibility of commitment. An opportunity awaited me at headquarters, and I prepared to accept the position I had previously declined twice. As I removed my light jacket, my fingers grazed the bulge at my belt. I couldn't fathom why I had held onto it for so long. Time and again, I had attempted to discard it, yet I couldn't bring myself to do so. The danger it posed was unreasonable, yet its presence brought me comfort, as if reclaiming a piece of myself. Without further contemplation, I drew out the heavy hammer from its hiding place and released it into the depths of the sea.